but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first. My father rants.
In the polished world of Hollywood, Ron Howard is the ultimate nice guy. We know him as the polite kid and the steady director. But staying at the top for 60 years requires more than just kindness, it requires a thick skin. Behind his famous smile lies a history of difficult sets and clashing egos. Howard didn't just witness greatness, he survived it. These are the 6 actors who challenged his patience and showed him the industry's sharpest edges. Frances Bavier, the mask of the matriarch. To the millions of Americans who tuned into the Andy Griffith Show during the 60s, Frances Bavier was the personification of domestic warmth. As Aunt Bee, she was the stabilizing force of Mayberry, a woman whose biggest concerns were the quality of her pickles and the safety of her nephew, Opie. But for the young Ron Howard, the reality of working with Bavier was his first masterclass in the jarring disconnect between a public persona and a private reality. While the world saw a doting aunt, the cast and crew saw a classically trained New York stage actress who lived in a state of perpetual, icy professional disdain. Bavier did not see herself as part of an ensemble of good old boys in a rural comedy. She saw herself as a serious dramatic artist trapped in a medium she considered beneath her. This created a unique kind of friction on set, quiet evil of emotional coldness that a child actor like Howard was uniquely sensitive to. In a town like Mayberry, which was built on the foundation of communal love, Bavier was an island of professional austerity. She didn't want to be Aunt Bee once the camera stopped rolling, she wanted to be respected, and she felt that a sitcom about a small-town sheriff was an insult to her pedigree. For Howard, Bavier represented the professional disdain archetype. This isn't the loud, explosive anger of a diva, but rather the slow-burn resentment of someone who feels overqualified for their life. Howard has recounted in interviews and his memoir, The Boys, that Bavier was not a fan of the hijinks that Andy Griffith and Don Knotts engaged in. While the men were laughing and ad-libbing, Bavier remained rigid. As a child, Howard looked to the adults on set for cues on how to behave. From Griffith, he learned leadership and humor. From Bavier, he learned that the person smiling at you in the script might be the one most likely to ignore you at the craft services table. The tension was not merely atmospheric, it was a wall. Howard noted that Bavier was deeply offended by the casual nature of the set. She reportedly once took a swing at actor Jim Nabors with an umbrella because his singing annoyed her. For a young Ronnie Howard, this was a confusing introduction to the mask of Hollywood. He had to learn to perform intimacy with a woman who, in reality, offered him nothing but polite distance or visible annoyance. This taught Howard a vital directorial lesson: the performance of chemistry is often an act of sheer will rather than a reflection of genuine affection. Bavier's behavior was a manifestation of the Golden Age ego, a belief that the craft of acting was a sacred, somber duty that should not be degraded by child's play or rural tropes. She struggled with the fact that, despite her decades of stage work, she would only ever be remembered for a character she essentially despised. This resentment bled into her interactions with Howard. She wasn't mean, in the traditional sense, but she was emotionally unavailable, creating a vacuum where a young performer expected a mentor. It was a coldness that forced Howard to grow up faster, realizing that a family on screen is often just a collection of strangers holding a contract. This friction reached its peak during the later years of the show. While the rest of the cast remained a tight-knit unit, Bavier retreated further into her shell. She eventually retired to North Carolina, becoming a recluse and refusing to participate in many of the reunions that Howard and Griffith cherished. It was a tragic end to a career, defined by a woman who couldn't reconcile her talent with her fame. Howard has often spoken of her with a mix of pity and respect, acknowledging that her unhappiness made her difficult, but her discipline made her a pro. By navigating the chilly waters of Bavier's temperament, Howard learned the first rule of Hollywood survival: the character is a lie. He learned that you could create a masterpiece of warmth while standing in a room full of ice. Bavier was the first person to show him that behind the gilded image of a Hollywood legend, there is often a person struggling with a profound sense of misplaced identity. She was his first encounter with the Golden Age ghost, the actor who is haunted by the roles they feel they should have played. But if Bavier was a cold breeze in a small town, the next encounter was a hurricane in a silk robe. Yul Brynner, the tyranny of the icon. If Francis Xavier represented the cold, internal resentment of a fading era, Yul Brynner was the opposite, a blazing, external sun that demanded every planet in the room orbit around him. Ron Howard encountered Brynner on the set of the 1959 film The Journey. Howard was only 5 years old, a tiny red-headed boy thrust into the presence of a man who didn't just play kings, he believed he was one. Brynner, famous for his shaved head and his booming, authoritative voice in The King and I, carried an aura of absolute power that made no concessions for the presence of a child. This was Howard's first encounter with the divine right of kings, an archetype of the Golden Age where the star was not just a lead actor, but a sovereign ruler of the set. Brynner's evil, if one could call it that, was a form of psychological intimidation. He moved through the production with a rigid, terrifying grace. For a child like Howard, who was used to the gentle, paternal guidance of his own father, Rance Howard, Brynner was an alien force. He was a man who didn't speak, he issued decrees. He didn't walk, he processed. Howard recalls being genuinely frightened by Brynner's intensity. The actor had a way of looking through people rather than at them, a technique designed to maintain his status as the most important person in any room. In the world of 50s cinema, stars like Brynner were protected by a studio system that treated them as gods, and Brynner leaned into that divinity with every fiber of his being. This was a lesson in the atmosphere of fear. Howard watched as adult crew members, seasoned professionals who had worked on dozens of films, scramble to appease Brynner's every whim. If the lighting wasn't perfect, if a line was flubbed, if the energy on set wasn't exactly to his liking, Brynner's disapproval wasn't a conversation, it was a climate shift. For Howard, this was a formative experience in understanding how a single ego can hijack a collective creative process. It was the antithesis of the collaborative spirit Howard would later champion as a director. Brynner was the immovable object, a man whose commitment to his own myth outweighed the comfort of his colleagues. The friction here wasn't born of a personal grudge, it's unlikely Brynner even considered a 5-year-old a peer worth having a grudge with, but rather a fundamental clash of philosophies. Howard was learning the Midwestern style of work: be prepared, be kind, and be part of the team. Brynner represented the continental style: be the spectacle, be the mystery, and be the master. Howard has noted that Brynner's presence was so overwhelming that it felt like the air left the room when he entered. This wasn't just stardom, it was a form of professional tyranny that relied on the subordination of everyone else's identity. Brynner also possessed a legendary penchant for control over his image. He was a talented photographer and a man of high culture, but these interests often served to further distance him from the common folk on set. He wouldn't engage in the small talk or the camaraderie that builds a sense of safety for a young performer. Instead, he maintained a wall of exoticism. He was the other, a figure of such intense self-seriousness that it bordered on the absurd. Howard, even at a young age, could sense that this wasn't just acting. It was a lifestyle of curated dominance. Decades later, when Howard transitioned into directing, the ghost of Yul Brynner likely sat on his shoulder as a reminder of what not to do. Howard's sets are famously relaxed and egalitarian, a direct reaction to the emperor model he witnessed in his youth. He learned from Brynner that while fear can produce a powerful performance, it also creates a brittle environment where people are too afraid to innovate. Brynner showed him that the icon is often a cage not just for the people working with them, but for the actor themselves, who must constantly perform their own greatness. Howard's time with Brynner was a baptism by fire. It taught him that Hollywood wasn't just a playground, it was a hierarchy. To survive, one had to learn how to stand their ground in the shadow of a giant. Brynner was the ultimate personification of the Golden Age's darkest trait, the belief that genius grants a license to be unreachable. He was a king without a kingdom, ruling over a sound stage with an iron fist, leaving a young Ron Howard to wonder if there was a way to reach the top without losing one's humanity. Brynner ruled by presence, but in the 80s, Howard would face a new kind of defiance, the intellectual blockade. Shelley Long, The Perfectionist's Purgatory. Where Yul Brynner's dominance was a relic of a vanishing empire, Shelley Long represented a modern, more cerebral kind of friction. By 1982, Ron Howard was at a crossroads. He was no longer the child actor under the thumb of icons, he was a young director trying to prove he had the authority to lead a major feature film. The project was Night Shift, a comedy that required a delicate balance of zany energy and grounded heart. In Shelley Long, Howard found a brilliant comedienne, but he also encountered an analytical anchor, an actress whose process was so meticulous and questioning that it threatened to grind the production to a halt. Long came from the rigorous world of Chicago's Second City, a background that emphasized intellectual deconstruction and character motivation. While Michael Keaton was improvising at a mile a minute and Henry Winkler was leaning into his natural warmth, Long was often the brakes on the set. She didn't just want to say the lines, she wanted to know the molecular structure of why her character, Belinda, would choose those specific words. For Howard, this was a baptism into the world of star management. He wasn't just directing a movie, he was negotiating a daily peace treaty between the schedule and a star's obsessive perfectionism. The friction with Long wasn't born of malice, but of a mismatch in tempo. Howard, having grown up in the high-efficiency world of sitcoms where time is money, valued momentum. Long, conversely, seemed to view the set as a laboratory. Industry lore and cast reflections from that era often paint a picture of an actress who was not always the easiest to get along with, not because she was a diva, in the fur coat and tantrum sense, but because she was a perfectionist who could be oblivious to the needs of the ensemble. On the set of Night Shift, this manifested as endless questions and a desire for one more take. Long after the director was satisfied, Howard had to learn a vital lesson in directorial psychology. The analytical anchor isn't trying to be evil, they are trying to be safe. For Long, the scrutiny of every detail was a shield against failure. But for a director, that shield can become a wall. Howard found himself in a position where he had to validate her concerns without letting them sabotage the film's energy. This was his first real experience with the intellectual blockade, a situation where an actor uses their intelligence as a form of control. If they can outthink the director, they can effectively take over the set. The tension was exacerbated by the technical habits Long developed, habits that would later become famous on the set of Cheers. There were whispers that she would accidentally move in ways that forced the camera to stay on her, a subtle form of scene stealing that drove co-stars to frustration. On Night Shift, this created a competitive atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the family vibe Howard craved. He realized that a director's job isn't just about the camera, it's about managing the gravity of stars. Long had a high gravitational pull, and if Howard didn't stay firm, the entire movie would be sucked into her singular orbit. This experience was a turning point for Howard's leadership style. He realized that being a nice guy wasn't enough, he had to be a clear guy. He learned to set boundaries with performers who equated process with stalling. He also learned to appreciate the result, even if the journey was grueling. Long is undoubtedly brilliant in Night Shift, bringing a vulnerability to Belinda that another actress might have missed. Howard recognized that the friction produced a diamond, but the heat of that friction nearly melted the machine. Looking back, the beef with Shelley Long is a classic example of the director's dilemma. How much of a star's difficult behavior do you tolerate for the sake of the performance? Long challenged Howard to find his voice. She showed him that even in a comedy about morgue attendants and love brokers, the internal psychological battles are where the real drama lives. She was the first person to tell him that the most difficult part of directing isn't the lighting or the script, it's the human ego, disguised as the work. Where Long used questions to slow the gears, the next star used raw, unpredictable fire to heat them. Russell Crowe, the volatile alchemist. If Shelley Long's friction was a slow-motion intellectual grind, Russell Crowe was a lightning strike. By the time Ron Howard cast Crowe in A Beautiful Mind, the actor was already a legend of the mercurial variety, a man whose physical intensity and hair-trigger temperament were as famous as his Oscar-caliber talent. Howard, the perennial seeker of harmony, was suddenly tasked with directing a volatile alchemist, a performer who believed that great art could only be forged in the heat of a high-pressure furnace. This was not a clash of styles, but a clash of temperaments, the boy next door versus the gladiator. Crowe brought a method intensity to the set that often translated into a desire for total creative control. He didn't just play John Nash, he occupied him, and he expected the production to bend to the needs of that occupation. Howard has recounted that Crowe would ask good, hard questions, which is the director's polite shorthand for intense, multi-hour debates about a single line of dialogue or the placement of a prop. Crowe was a man who used his intelligence and his physical presence to dominate the space. On the set of A Beautiful Mind, and later Cinderella Man, the friction was palpable. Crowe was known for a short fuse, famously getting into an altercation with a producer at an awards show during this era, and that danger followed him onto the sound stage. For Howard, managing Crowe was a lesson in the burden of brilliance. He realized that with certain actors, the evil isn't a lack of professionalism, but an excess of it, a commitment so deep it becomes destructive to the social fabric of the crew. Howard had to act as a lion tamer, providing enough space for Crowe's genius to roam without letting it maul the supporting cast or the schedule. The friction here was about boundaries. Crowe would push, and Howard, in his quiet but firm way, had to push back. It was a high-stakes poker game played out over months of filming, where the currency was respect. One of the most famous examples of this friction occurred when Crowe insisted on shooting A Beautiful Mind in chronological order, a logistical nightmare for any production, let alone one with a modest budget. Howard initially resisted, citing the mosaic nature of filmmaking. But Crowe was relentless. He argued that the psychological decay of John Nash couldn't be faked by jumping around the timeline. In a rare move, Howard pivoted. He saw that Crowe wasn't being difficult for the sake of ego, he was being difficult for the sake of the truth. This was the turning point in their relationship. Howard learned that with a volatile alchemist you don't fight the fire, you channel it. However, the psychological toll on Howard was significant. Unlike his sets with Tom Hanks or Steve Martin, where the atmosphere was one of light-hearted collaboration, the Crowe sets were heavy with the work. There were days of silence, days of heated debate, and days where the air felt thick with Crowe's dissatisfaction. Howard had to develop a new kind of directorial skin, one that could absorb the blows of a leading man's mercurial moods without bruising. He learned that some actors don't want a nice director, they want a partner who is as obsessed as they are. This period marked Howard's transition from a director of movies to a director of performances. By surviving the fire of Russell Crowe, he proved he could handle the most dangerous elements Hollywood had to offer. He recognized that the evil of a difficult temperament is often just the shadow cast by an immense talent. Crowe pushed Howard out of his comfort zone, forcing him to abandon the safety of the OP persona and become a leader who could command a room through sheer competence and intellectual stamina. Howard and Crowe emerged as friends and frequent collaborators, but the scars of those early battles remained. Crowe showed Howard that conflict isn't always something to be avoided, sometimes, it is the fuel that powers a masterpiece. He was the first to show Howard that the nice guy can only win if he is also the strongest man in the room. By mastering the art of the Crowe clash, Howard earned a new kind of stripes in the industry, the reputation of a man who could tame the untamable. Managing a genius is a marathon, managing a tragedy, however, is a heartbreak. Tom Sizemore, The Lost Highway. While Russell Crowe represented the fire of genius, Tom Sizemore represented a far more tragic form of Hollywood friction, the slow-motion collapse of reliability. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Sizemore was one of the industry's most sought-after tough guys, a powerhouse performer who could hold his own against giants like Robert De Niro and Tom Hanks. But by the time he crossed paths with Ron Howard, particularly during the era of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, where he had a small, uncredited role, and the broader industry circles Howard navigated, Sizemore was becoming the poster child for the liability of vice. For Howard, a man who views a film set as a sacred, collaborative family, Sizemore's presence was a painful introduction to the unpredictable shadow. Sizemore's evil wasn't a malicious intent to harm the film, but rather the total abandonment of the professional contract due to substance abuse. Howard's sets are built on a foundation of Midwestern work ethic, show up early, know your lines, and respect the crew. Sizemore, caught in the grip of severe addiction, often lived in direct opposition to those values. He became a figure of heartbreak friction. Unlike a diva who demands more trailers or a perfectionist who demands more takes, an actor struggling with addiction creates a vacuum of anxiety. Every day they are on the call sheet, the director isn't wondering if the scene will be great, they are wondering if the actor will show up at all. For Howard, managing a talent like Sizemore was an exercise in the ethics of the industry. How do you protect a massive production, which employs hundreds of people and costs millions of dollars, when one of the key moving parts is a human being in the midst of a breakdown? Howard has often spoken about the sadness of witnessing immense talent being eclipsed by personal demons. He observed Sizemore as part of a larger Hollywood cautionary tale, the actor who has the world at his feet but is being pulled into the earth by his own shadow. This wasn't a clash of egos, it was a clash between the gilded potential of a career and the gritty reality of human frailty. The friction with Sizemore also highlighted the limits of Howard's nice guy diplomacy. When an actor's personal life begins to endanger the safety or the morale of the set, the director must pivot from being a mentor to being a guardian of the production. Howard had to learn the hard way that you cannot kindness someone out of a crisis. This realization was a sobering one for a director who prides himself on creating a supportive environment. Sizemore represented the evil of wasted time, the hundreds of hours lost to delays, the creative energy siphoned off to manage a crisis, and the general feeling of being held hostage by one person's volatility. Moreover, Sizemore's presence served as a reminder of the industry's fixer culture. During this era, studios were still attempting to manage the bad boy image of their stars through handlers and interventions. Howard found himself in the middle of this machinery, trying to extract a performance from a man who was often barely there. It taught Howard about the fragility of the machine. He saw that even the most expensive, most professional production in the world can be derailed by the chemical imbalance of a single individual. It made Howard hypervigilant about casting, leading him to prioritize character in the personal sense as much as the theatrical one. Looking back, the beef with Sizemore is less about a specific on-set fight and more about a fundamental disagreement on the sanctity of the work. Howard views filmmaking as a privilege. Sizemore, at his low points, treated it like a burden or a distraction from his inner turmoil. This friction forced Howard to define his own boundaries. It showed him that while he could be a nice guy, he could not be a doormat for chaos. He learned that the greatest good in filmmaking is the protection of the collective effort, even if that means making the difficult decision to distance oneself from a friend or a talent who is no longer reliable. He was the heartbreak pillar of Howard's experience, a man whose friction didn't just heat the set, it burned the house down. Through Sizemore, Howard learned that the most difficult part of directing isn't the actors who fight you, it's the actors who aren't there to fight at all. Sometimes, the greatest friction isn't with an enemy, but with a friend whose shadow is eclipsing your own. The most complex friction in Ron Howard's career didn't come from an enemy, but from his best friend. On the set of Happy Days, Howard was the undisputed lead, the Richie Cunningham, around whom the 50s nostalgia was built. But within a few seasons, a cultural phenomenon occurred. Henry Winkler's The Fonz didn't just become popular, he became the son. For Howard, this was the ultimate test of ego. He found himself in the paradox of the sidekick, a situation where his character remained the moral center, but his status in the industry's eyes was being eroded by a leather-clad supporting player. The friction here was unique because it wasn't personal. Howard and Winkler loved each other. Winkler was, and is, the godfather to Howard's children. Yet, the evil was structural. Howard has admitted that the network's treatment of him changed almost overnight. Executives began speaking to him with a disrespect that stung. They floated the idea of changing the show's title to Fonz's Happy Days, a move so insulting to Howard's professional standing that he threatened to quit. He wasn't jealous of Winkler's success, he was protective of his own dignity. This was a lesson in the erasure of the lead, how quickly Hollywood will toss aside a reliable workhorse for a flashy thoroughbred. Howard handled this with a maturity that was beyond his years, a phrase Winkler himself uses to describe the teenage Howard. While the press tried to stir up a rivalry, Howard focused on the work. He realized that Winkler's brilliance was good for the show, but he also realized that he could no longer stay in a house where he was being treated like a second-class citizen. This friction became the primary catalyst for his transition to directing. If the network didn't respect him as an actor, he would become the one who hired the actors. In their later years, the two discussed this openly on a podcast. Howard confessed, "It did hurt my feelings." It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who usually keeps his cards close to his chest. This part highlights the most human friction of all, the pain of being eclipsed. Howard's ability to remain friends with Winkler while navigating that professional hurt is perhaps his greatest achievement. It showed that nice guy isn't a weakness, it's a form of extreme emotional intelligence. Winkler didn't just provide a sidekick for Richie, he provided the final push Ron Howard needed to stop playing a character and start building an empire. Howard's journey through the golden and new Hollywood ages wasn't a walk through a garden, it was a navigation of a minefield. From the cold disdain of Francis Xavier to the volcanic genius of Russell Crowe, he encountered every version of the Hollywood shadow. But Howard didn't let the friction burn him. Instead, he used it to polish his own craft. He learned that the evil in Hollywood isn't usually a villain in a black hat, it's the collision of insecure egos, the weight of addiction, and the fickle nature of the marketplace. Today, Howard stands as one of the most successful directors in history, a man who survived the sharp edges of the greats to create a style of his own. He proved that you can face the 6 most evil, or at least most difficult, archetypes and emerge with your integrity intact. His ledger isn't one of grudges, but of lessons. He is the man who saw the darkness behind the curtain and decided to stay in the light. Subscribe to keep uncovering the truth behind the legends. Thanks for watching. More remains a ghost in Howard's career, a reminder of what happens when the gilded cage of Hollywood provides too much money and too little accountability.